going to go to our next panelist, which is Dr. Meghan McBride. Dr. Meghan is the Vice President of Adult Education. She is a former adult learner who's worked in education since 2007. I mentioned she's currently serving as the Vice President for Adult Education at Georgia Piedmont Technical College in metropolitan Atlanta, Georgia, where she has worked since 2018. In this position, she oversees a large program that serves more than 3,000 students annually in adult basic education, corrections, English as a second language, and integrated English integrated English literacy and civics education, as well as testing centers that offer the GED exam and HiSET. So, Dr. Meghan McBride, I'm going to go ahead and move forward in your slides. We'd love to hear from
you. Thank you, Sharon. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Meghan McBride, and I am a former adult learner from the small rural town of Moultrie, Georgia. I dropped out of school with only an 8th grade education after experiencing a series of crisis pregnancies that began when I was just 14 years old. While pregnant for the 3rd time at 16 years old, I enrolled in an adult education program that helped put me on the path to economic self-sufficiency, which allowed me to escape an abusive relationship with my children's father and follow my dreams. After earning my GED, I went to a technical college to learn job skills that led me to meaningful employment. And what you're seeing here in these pictures, on the left is me with my first baby just 6 weeks after I turned 15 years old. And on the right is me with my second child at 17. And the week before that, I earned my GED, which is pictured below. Next slide, please. While working and parenting full-time, I also attended Valdosta State University full-time, where eventually I earned bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees. And there I am with all of my degrees. Over the course of the last 14 years, I have worked in various positions in the field of education. My journey has come full circle, as I now serve as Vice President for Adult Education at Georgia Piedmont Technical College in Metro Atlanta. Like Sharon said, my program serves over 3,000 students annually in adult basic education, English as a second language, and corrections programs. As a former adult learner, I understand the unique challenges and barriers that our students face. The pandemic has interrupted schooling across this country for an entire generation of students on an unprecedented scale. But for adult learners, for whom educational and social inequities have long existed, schooling interruptions are all too precedented, and the pandemic has only served to amplify those conditions. During the pandemic, innumerable accommodations have been afforded to schools and students in K through 12 to help mitigate the effects of the schooling interruption, like suspension of standardized testing mandates and distribution of technology and wireless internet access for students. Although it took a near universal schooling disruption for this to happen, it demonstrates what is possible for adult education. As we have seen, systemic changes are achievable when schooling interruption is normalized. Our students, who have re-entered school after already experiencing a disruption because of some life circumstance, need accommodations such as these. Next slide, please. Lack of access to technology has always been an educational barrier for economically marginalized students like the ones we serve, and that has been amplified in the pandemic. Local programs such as mine have carried a heavy burden for making our services accessible to students using existing grant allocations. My program has not seen any increase in funding to help us reach our students. Thankfully, our state office delivered a learning management system to the local programs to help us reach our students. Not a single member of my staff, other than me, had any experience with this particular LMS. Because our program received no additional funding to build the LMS, I had to pivot 3 full-time staff members from their pre-pandemic duties to LMS development. And over the course of 9 months, they worked tirelessly to build a content-rich framework, while the remaining teachers used an a la carte toolbox to deliver instruction remotely. To date, we have not returned to face-to-face instruction because of the heightened pandemic risk in our area. Instead, we rely completely on our homegrown LMS to teach our students. Next slide, please. The pandemic fundamentally altered how adult learners are served in Georgia. Prior to the shutdown in March 2020, only 5% of student contact hours were distance learning, and only 2% of Georgia's adult learners were distance education students. Since the pandemic, 96% of all contact hours are distance learning, and 93% of students are distance education students. In my program, both of those numbers are 100%. Next slide, please. For a variety of reasons, including accessibility and the long-term closure of K-12 schools in our area, the pandemic has had a dramatic and lasting impact on adult education enrollment. In Georgia, when comparing FY21 enrollment to date with FY20 enrollment to February prior to the pandemic, we can see that our total enrollment has declined by 57%. That is nearly 19,000 students just in Georgia, fewer than before, who are receiving basic literacy and numeracy instruction because of the pandemic. Next slide, please. In my local program, we have seen an even more dramatic decline in enrollment. Our corrections program, as you can see, has all but disappeared, with a 96% drop in enrollment. Although we have been able to set up remote instruction in all 3 of our correctional facilities, various pandemic-related challenges have precluded those students from attending classes remotely. To date, we have served only 8 students in corrections this fiscal year, all of them remotely. Overall, our program's enrollment has dropped over 70% from last fiscal year. The data clearly show that we are not reaching our students. Thousands of students need help accessing our programs, and we need help reaching them. These students desperately need our services, particularly in the midst of an economic downturn, when learning basic literacy and numeracy skills could lead to families being lifted out of poverty by finding meaningful employment. Adult education transforms. I know that because I am the product of adult education. I would not be where I am today without an accessible adult education program. For thousands of adult learners across the country, the pandemic has made an education even harder to access. As my personal story demonstrates, students like me can thrive after a schooling interruption with the proper support. Without adult education, I might still be living in poverty. Instead, I used my GED to transform my life trajectory by attending college, which allowed me to access a career where I could earn a family-sustaining wage. The complexity of the work required to reach our already hard-to-reach students in the midst of a large-scale interruption requires additional funding and support to implement systemic changes that make adult education more accessible at all times, but especially in the context of this existential crisis. We have an opportunity and a responsibility to rethink the schooling interruption brought on by the pandemic as a possibility to accommodate and innovate for our students, to allow for more equitable and responsive forms of education that can lead to life-changing outcomes. Thank you.